Hello, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar on navigating Nordic discontent. We are going to be looking into electoral patterns, voting behavior, and its links and connections to spatial inequalities, regional disparities, and the green transition. We here at Nordregio have done some very interesting research, and we can't wait to share some of the highlights with you. And we've also got some experts in a panel to expand the views even further. For the next hour and a half, we will share some research insights with you, but we also hope to have an active discussion not only with our speakers and panelists, but also with you. So we hope that you came with a lot of questions and comments, and let's make this an interactive and interesting discussion. My name is Miia Itänen. I am a senior communications advisor here at Nordregio, and I will be your host for this session. Let's have a quick look at the agenda and see what we've got in store for today. The next hour and a half are split into more or less two parts. We will start with research presentations. We will hear from our researchers here at Nordregio, from Myriam Chilvers, on some of the key concepts and definitions related to discontent and geographies of discontent. We will then continue with Kamila Dzhavatova, our GIS analyst, and look at some of the voting patterns that we're seeing across the Nordic region to see if we can really spot some trends or patterns emerging. And we will deepen that analysis with Tapia, our senior research fellow, who will share some insights from our modeling and analysis. We see that the issue is very complicated, and that probably will not solve all of the questions that we have or that you might have. So once we're done with the presentations, we will continue with a panel discussion and look at green transition in the age of discontent. How does it work? What are the obstacles? What are the opportunities? What kind of risks and chances do we see going forward? For the panel, we've got Merethe, Dotterud, Leiren joining us, as well as Tomas, Hanell, and Susanne, Wallman, Lundåsen. So we will hear from Susanne from Linköping University, from Tomas Hanell from the Finnish Migration Institute, and Merethe from CICERO, a research center. And they have looked at different aspects of the topic, so they will bring in complementary views to what we will cover in the first part. And finally, after all these presentations and discussion, we will wrap up with some policy recommendations and policy implications. What should we do going forward? Before we dive into the discussion, I would also like to get a little bit of a sense of who is here today. We were happy to see very high interest towards this session, a lot of registrations, and I just want to know who's following us here today. So I've just launched a little poll. Please let us know a little bit about your background. What type of profile do you have? And what brings you here today? What do you hope to get from the discussion? While you do that, I will also just outline a few practical notes. This webinar will be recorded. You will have access to the recording as well as all of the material afterwards. It'll be available on our website soon after the webinar. We are also launching a new policy brief and a new publication today. As a part of this discussion, you will have access to those as well as the other material coming from the project that we've been working on. So all of this will be available to you. So for now, you only need to focus on the discussion and share your remarks and inputs as well. How to do that? You've got the chat at your disposal. So you can send us comments and questions through the chat. And if you've already responded to the poll, I would actually like you to give the chat a go. We are also looking at the chat, and we'll be picking up your questions from there. So let us know where you're joining from, if you already have some questions that you want us to tackle, and what you want to cover in today's webinar. As said, our insights and what we share builds on research that we have been doing as a part of a project called INEC, Inclusive Growth in the Times of Economic in green transition and so forth. That is a project funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and for the past few years, since 2021, we have been looking at different aspects of green transition, how it plays into regional inequalities, how it influences regional economic development, what type of climate change impacts are coming. And now, today, we will look into discontent and voting behavior specifically, looking at how those overlap or link with the green transition and discontent. So building on a lot of research, a lot of analysis, but also practical interviews and insights. To get the conversation going, we will start by defining some key concepts and outline what we actually mean with geographies of discontent and how discontent is defined in the research literature and how we can start tackling such a complex topic. To do that, I will invite our colleague Myriam Chilvers to give a very brief overview of geographies of discontent and how it works. Myriam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Miia. Yeah, exactly. Just as you said, so my role today is to give you a brief but hopefully clear overview of the main term of this webinar, which is geographies of discontent. So I'm going to go over what it is, where it comes from, and what, according to a vast body of research, is driving these geographies of discontent throughout the Western democrat liberal world, but also hint at what's perhaps happening here in the Nordics as well. But before I get into geographies of discontent, I want to stop a little bit on the term of discontent, and more specifically, political discontent. Because for the purpose of our study and also for the purpose of this discussion today, we have loosely defined it. So we loosely define it as the dissatisfaction or the frustration that the ordinary citizen can feel towards their democratically elected government. And this type of political dissatisfaction or discontent became widespread, particularly in the 2010s, to the point that this decade and the years following it have now been nicknamed by some as the age of discontent. And I'm sure all of you remember the widespread political and street protests that we witnessed during that decade on a wide range of issues on both sides of the political spectrum. But it's also particularly the change in electoral behavior, and more specifically the rise of the protest vote, the rise of the vote for the anti-establishment, the non-traditional and sometimes even new political party. And many people have spent much time trying to work out what is driving this particular high level of discontent in this decade. And there are two approaches that dominate the academic world to try to explain discontent, and that's the economic approach and the cultural approach. In the economic approach, researchers put forward the idea that it is the shift from the industrial to the post-industrial economies and the structural changes that entailed for globalization and automation that has led to a rise in inequality between those who are more mobile and educated and those who are from the more traditional and industrial workforce, creating significant job security inequalities and differences in wages, which in turn has led to discontent amongst those that feel left behind. More recently, there's also a focus on the increase in wealth concentration among the elite, and that combined with quite severe austerity measures throughout the 2010s has sort of led to disenchantment from the populations who feel that their elected governments are no longer as accountable as they thought they once were. The cultural approach, on the other hand, says it's not so much about the economic divide, it's about cultural divide, a divide that has been growing over the past century. And that has led to, when we've been fulfilling these sort of economic needs, led to the development of more post-material values such as self-fulfillment, independence, cosmopolitanism, and multiculturalism that has left some groups of the population feeling left behind and led to what they call a cultural backlash. And these changes have been led through significant and rapid progressive social changes over the last century, such as empowerment of women, access or much more widespread access to higher education and mass immigration. And that brings me to immigration, because you cannot mention discontent in the 2010s and the recent years without bringing up this complex issue of immigration and what impact it has probably had on discontent in our countries. It has had both an impact, or researchers agree that it has had a significant impact on both the economic approach and the cultural approach. It's a significant factor as it makes people feel fear for their loss of jobs, fear for a decrease in their wages, but it also leads to a fear for their cultural identity that may be under threat. And the last point I want to raise when discussing discontent is this crucial element that is quite complex, is that discontent can both be driven by real and perceived threats, so real and perceived economic and cultural threats. And this makes it particularly hard to understand and particularly hard to measure. And some researchers have even put forward the fact that it's not necessarily the most impacted that are the most discontent, or the most left behind that are the most discontent, but those that perceive that they are. Now, moving on to the term of today, the geographies of discontent, it became clear from the patterns, voting patterns of the 2010s, but also from the nature of some of the protests that emerged. And here's a photo of the yellow vest movements in France, that there was also a significant geographical element to discontent that needed to complement the economic and cultural approach. And this was the idea that territorial differences are perhaps more influential than the interpersonal factors that I have named previously within culture and economics when trying to understand discontent, as it was very clear that there were certain areas, certain geographical areas, that were experiencing higher levels of discontent than others. Now, traditionally, these areas have been divided between urban and rural areas. It is more complex than that. It is a division between the periphery and the central areas. And these nuances can be felt at national, even European level, regional level, but also within municipalities and within cities. And it's the idea that place, and if you're coming from a more periphery area, that could be driving your levels of discontent. And because of these, what we notice in the voting patterns, different terms emerged and re-emerged to try to understand this and to try to name them. This geographies of discontent being one of them, place-based resentment, left-behind areas, all trying to describe a similar phenomenon occurring throughout the Western world. And they became more and more popular because up until the financial crisis of 2008, it had appeared that these geographical differences that had long existed, specifically in voting patterns, were starting to decrease. But after the crisis, that we once again saw a growing spatial, social, economic, and cultural divergence, and the emergence of more and more left-behind areas with sort of distinct forms of political discontent, political protest. And they have in common a certain four overarching drivers that we can see in literature, so which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but I'll go through them now today. There's economic spatial divergence, the idea that globalization and the knowledge economy has benefited urban and central areas more than the peripheral and the old industrial areas that are now facing economic decline. There's also a potential social divide increase between the urban and rural areas, driven mainly by disparities in service provision, particularly in education and healthcare. There's also, according to the research that we've been looking into, significant recognition gap and cultural divide emerging again in the rural areas, but the periphery areas that are feeling or are neglected and feel disrespected by urban elites, and feel that their voice and vote matters slightly less than those in the inner central areas. And there's evidence that the media and the political discourse has fueled this place-based resentment. Some, however, argue that it's not about the place, it's about the people who live in the places, and they do have significant differences in demographics. There's significant age, sex, education, and income differences between the more central and the periphery areas, with the urban areas attracting usually a younger, more female, more liberal population. And to end, I would like to go back to the topic of today, which is geographies of discontent in the Nordics. Is this something we can talk about? Is it something that we see in the Nordics? And if so, what may be driving it? So I'm not going to be the one to answer that very complex question. I'm going to let my colleagues do that. But I did want to highlight what has sort of framed and influenced our empirical research over the last few months. And that's the fact that given that the Nordic countries are all Western liberal democracies, we do not see any reason to not believe that the drivers of geographies and discontent in other areas are also potentially playing a role also here in the Nordics. From economic divergence, of course, with issues of competition and attractiveness in the Nordics, social divides and divides in public service provision, a recognition gap and cultural divide with signs of perceived neglect and stigmatization being felt in rural areas throughout the Nordics, and demographic factors such as aging population and more male populations living in the rural areas. And we're very conscious, of course, that the Nordic region does distinguish itself from the rest of the Western world. It has more stable parliamentary democracies, much more decentralized, and a wider and deeper welfare state. So we took all this into account, and we used these factors to try to establish wherever we can see geographies of discontent in the Nordic context. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Myriam. I think that's a good start for our discussion. And as you said, there are a lot of questions that we can and should look deeper into. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Just a quick update. We had that poll running in the beginning. First of all, thank you very much for inputs. We had a very good response rate. Almost all of you gave us some input. And I've just put the results on the screen so that you see it as well. In terms of participants, we have about third of participants from the policy and administration or governmental sphere of activities. We also have about 40% researchers and academics. If you have research results to share as we continue with the discussion, do post those in the chat. I saw a few links there already, and there's definitely room for more, so we can use this chance to share information also with each other. Then we've also got about 10% of civil society and NGO participants and another 10 from the private sector, as well as some others. So thanks a lot for those inputs. In terms of what you expect and what I hope we will get into as the discussion advances, you were hoping to understand the trends in political discontent and the role of green transition. And we already start to see that there might be some linkages, and we'll go deeper into it. We will also look at the regional inequalities and how that plays into it. I was also happy to see that we have a very international audience in the room today. We will be focusing on the Nordic context specifically, and we will start drilling into not only the level of countries, but even regions and municipalities. But if you have other remarks, or if you can share how that resembles your situation in the local environment, in your country or region, please do comment on that as well. So thank you very much for those. Myriam, I don't have any specific questions for you as of now, but you can always post more questions in the chat. We will come back and present your questions to our speakers and give you some answers. Now, as I said, we will go deeper with the discussion, and we will start looking at how these different lines shape the Nordic context, what we know about the voting behavior in the Nordics. We will do that with Kamila Dzhavatova from our GIS team, our GIS analyst, and Kamila will join us to tell us a little bit more about what we've noticed when we've looked at voting patterns across the Nordics and why we look at voting patterns. So Kamila, over to you.
Thank you, Miia. So my name is Kamila Dzhavatova. I'm a GIS and data analyst at Nordregio, joining the webinar today from Oslo. And I will talk a bit more about the spatial dimensions of discontent that we see from the data. So as Myriam already mentioned, discontent is quite a complex concept, and it's difficult to define and difficult to measure it using just one indicator. If we could move to the next slide. So in most studies on geographies of discontent, it is measured through voting behavior and electoral behavior. And one reason for that is that studies show that rural residents are less likely to be informally politically engaged at urban residents, for example, by attending protests or signing petitions, and they are more likely to express dissatisfaction and discontent through voting. And when considering for the Nordic region, voting data is the best available proxy for us to analyze and discuss political discontent. It is reliable, it is complete, it is available at the local level for us, at the municipal level, and it's comparable across the Nordic countries. So in our analysis, we focused on two indicators, turnout and share of votes for populist parties. And we used local level voting data, municipal level voting data for national elections. I think it's important to note here that electoral behavior cannot provide a full understanding of political discontent. because discontent is about complex feeling, and voting data alone cannot reveal their specific nature. And for example, people can have different levels of trust and discontent towards different political actors or different parts of the political system. And it's not that straightforward how it translates into electoral choices. But still, talking about discontent using data, it is a good enough proxy that we are using. So moving on to the next slide, when talking about spatial dimensions of discontent, we often use categories like urban and rural, and I think it might be helpful here to briefly outline where these definitions come from, because definitions are important for us. So it is somewhat tricky to define rural areas, and at the European level, the main way to do that is by using the Tigurba degree of urbanization classification developed by Eurostat. And this classification, it is made to work on European level, but because of different geographies and differences, especially in population density, it's not optimal for the Nordic region. So Nordregio has developed a new Nordic urban-rural typology, which is tailored specifically for the Nordic region. It was developed using grid statistical data on population, on building density, and on land use intensity. This classification divides urban and rural areas into 7 categories, but here I will mostly use our simplified municipal level version with just 3 classes. But the typology is also available on grid level with 7 categories. So now we can move on to the indicators that we've selected and to spatial variation for these indicators. And the first one is the voting turnout. First of all, we looked at the turnout trends over time, and we can see that there is no clear downward trend for Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. But Finland, it saw a decline from 80+% in the 60s to 65% in the 90s, but it is now stable. And Iceland and Greenland, they show a clear decline since the 80s. But there are also significant spatial differences within the Nordic countries, which I think are more interesting to talk about. So the map on the right here, it shows voter turnout in recent national level elections in each municipality as a percentage point relative to national average. So it's a municipal result and the distance to national average. We use this method because it removes differences in participation levels between the countries. And that way we can see a more clear view of spatial differences across the whole of the Nordic region. So the map here, it shows us that the urban areas and municipalities near major cities, they generally showed higher turnout that's seen in metropolitan areas in Finland and in Norway. So that's where turnout generally is higher than the national average. And in contrast, the rural and especially sparsely populated rural areas, especially in northern Norway, Sweden and Finland, that show lower voter engagement. But there are still lots of exceptions here. For example, the inner urban areas in Stockholm and in Malmö, as well as some municipalities close to capital cities in Sweden and Finland had low turnout. And at the same time, the several rural areas showed higher than average turnout. For example, many rural municipalities in southwestern Norway. And Denmark, Greenland, and Iceland show more mixed patterns, with some rural areas demonstrating strong voter turnout and engagement, while others show below average turnout. So linking that to the discontent, we can say that lower turnout in rural areas may indicate higher political discontent. But we, of course, should remember that there are other factors like socioeconomic status that can also influence participation. Now we can move to the next, another concept that we've selected here, which is a populist vote. Well, that's another concept that's so difficult to define. And we use a definition from a populist project, which is a widely used peer-reviewed classification of European parties based on the survey. I need to mention here that their definition mainly catches right-wing populism, while left-wing populism is more pronounced in other categories that developed, which is Eurosceptic parties. So the map here, it shows the percentage of votes which go for populist parties, like parties defined as populist according to the populist project, in national level elections again and compared to the national average. So it's the same approach as we used for the turnout map. And first of all, we can see here above average support for populist parties in most parts of Sweden and Finland. And in the south of Sweden, especially Skåne, there is a strong backing for populist parties, which is super pronounced on the map. And Finland, urban regions demonstrate lower populist support, and Denmark, it's again like more balanced distribution with stronger political support in southern region and lower support in urbanized. Norway here, again, it shows similar pattern where rural and coastal regions show stronger political support for populist parties, and urban centers like Oslo and Bergen show below average support. But actually, the results of discontent, if you look at the numbers, they show that voting for populist parties is more pronounced in intermediate areas. At the same time, like urban populations show the least electoral expression of discontent. So there are lots of things to think about, I think, but I will end here. But I will mention that we've created a range of interesting maps showing spatial variations for all the other indicators that we used in the analysis, not only those related to the voting, and they're now available in our website. I think the maps are a good way to explore spatial dimension of discontent. Yeah.
Thank you, Kamila. Thank you for sharing some of these insights and putting it on a map. We can understand much more the local and regional differences when you see how things align. There were a few questions in the chat. People were asking why we're missing Faroe Islands and Iceland and why some regions are not covered. We've added some links in the chat about the methodology behind the urban-rural typology and how the data has been collected. So you can refer to those, but basically it has to do with data availability and comparability, and we try to find ways to find comparable data, and that's also, as Kamila explained, why we look at voting as a proxy for discontent, because as we've already seen, it's a very complicated issue, and as we've already heard, voting patterns or behaviors do not explain all of it. There is even more, and we are going to go more into those factors and what else is behind and what are the drivers. But for now, I've already launched another poll, and I would just like to see how this sounds to you so far. How do you see political discontent in your region, in your area, in your community, in your municipality, in your surroundings? Do you see political discontent? And the answers are already coming in, and there is a majority who says yes, 67% right now, only 13% say no, and the rest, about 20%, are still a little bit uncertain. So this is definitely a phenomenon that we're all seeing around us, and there is a lot to unpack. So I will invite another colleague of mine, Carlos Tapia, our senior research fellow, who has done pretty sophisticated analysis and modeling on the different factors and how they play into this bigger picture. So let's go a little bit deeper and try to break it a bit into pieces and see what factors are at play. Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Miia. Thank you also to my colleagues who talked earlier because of the very excellent presentations on the concepts and the data evidence that we are using here. So I'm going to be talking about the modeling side of discontent. So I will try to shed some light on the processes that were put in place to actually measure this effect of different predictors on discontent. But before getting into the results, let me just say a few words about the methodology that we've used. We have essentially used econometric models to measure these effects or these associations between different predictors and populist vote, which in itself is a proxy for discontent, or at least that's what we were aiming at. And we have used two families of models. The first family is some fixed terms models, fixed effect models, in which these effects are measured at population level, so meaning for the Nordic region as a whole, And then we have two classic models, the ordinary listed square model, which is probably the most simple model you can use on a econometric setting, and also spatial model where the spatial dependencies are also considered in the modeling. And then we have a second family of models, which are these random effect models that allow for some degree of flexibility in the modeling by adding random intercepts in the first case, where the heterogeneity in the baseline value is considered in the modeling setting, and also random intercepts and slopes model where, other than in considering this heterogeneity of baseline values, we're also allowing for some degree of heterogeneity in the relationships between the predictor variables. So we have used these models for the same data that was briefly introduced before for 1,054 municipalities in Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And the reason why we are not including Iceland, Faroe Islands, and Åland is essentially because we don't have comparable data for many of the predictors that we are modeling here. So which are these predictors? As you see there on the screen, we have a special group of predictors that are green transition factors or variables. I will say more about them in a while, so I will not pay that much attention to those right now. But we also have some additional factors and controls that are normally mentioned in the literature as being determinant, as being important factors explaining discontent and populist patterns. The first of those is voting turnout, participation, that we have measured with the indicator that Kamila just presented a while ago. We also considered the territorial diversity aspect in a more detailed, fine-grained way as the one that was described a while ago. We have modeled 6 classes in terms of urbanization, from urban cores to sparsely populated areas. We're also including demographic and compositional factors, controlling for population of 60 and over years old, gender ratio, male to female proportions, share of foreign-born population residing in a municipality, and also educational attainment indicators, in particular the share of population with a university degree in each municipality. Additionally, we're also controlling for labor market indicators, in particular unemployment rates, sectoral composition of local employment, and the evolution of that composition over time, so that we tried to measure with that indicator the degree to which there's a stable employment composition in terms of industries and not big fluctuations on that, assuming that that change, structural change, could be associated with higher levels of discontent. And finally, we control for household finances in terms of equivalized household income, evolution of household income over time, and also income inequalities. And which these two are, as I said before, our main predictors, or those that we want to pay particular attention to, the green transition factors. And these have been covered from 2 perspectives. The first one is more related to the structural transition or structural processes of change in labor markets in terms of the green transition of existing jobs from being more environmentally harmful to being more environmentally neutral or even environmentally beneficial. And we have used the classification of green jobs produced by Ivona and colleagues in the US in 2018, that was then adopted by the OECD to do a similar analysis at the OECD level, and we have applied or transposed that classification to the Nordic level. And the classification is based on green tasks, not on green industries or green occupations, but on the analysis of which specific tasks are performed within each occupation and which is the degree of greening of those activities in the different areas. And by using that approach, we found out that roughly 3.4 million jobs could already be classified as green in the Nordic region. That is roughly 25% of the population. But also, like in the original classification, we see that greenness is particularly high in the less routine occupations requiring advanced degrees, such as science and engineering. And that is also explaining why there is a higher representation of those activities in the urban context. And we have also considered these green transition factors from the flip side, from the opposite perspective. So meaning how much or how far the existing economies at the local level would be contributing to emit more carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. And we have done also from two perspectives. One includes or looks into the average emissions per worker, which is the aerial map that you see on the screen. And a second perspective that is more specific on industrial emissions and localized industrial emissions in particular, that looks into how much emissions are being released to the atmosphere by the facilities that are listed in the European Pollutant Release and Transfer Registry, which includes the largest industrial pollutants across the European Union. So these two perspectives, one looks more at average emission intensities across sectors, and the other one being more specific on industrial emissions, allow for good complementary information. Something to note on the map is that the size of the circles that you see there are proportional to the amount of emissions that are generated by these facilities, and most of these facilities are included in the steel production, cement or petrochemical sectors, with examples like SSAB plants in Rye and Luleå in Sweden for steel production, or the Portland Aalborg in Denmark, or Cementa in Slite in Sweden for cement sector, for cement production, and several oil industry related plants across the Nordics, including refining plants and processing plants in all the countries, like Neste's facility in Port Vaux, or Lysekil's refining plant Preem's refining plant in Lysekil in Sweden, and several other installations in Norway, of course. So what are the results? Since we fit several models, we try to focus on those results that are more significant across all models, or more robust results, and those are the ones that you see on the screen right now. So when it comes to the green factors, we see that there is a robust negative association between the large greenhouse gas emission facility location and the propensity to see higher percentage of vote going to populist parties in the national elections. We also see that the electoral participation seems to be negatively associated with the share of vote going to populist parties. Negative association means the higher the value of these indicators, the lower the percentage of vote going to populist parties. We also see that urban cores and sparsely populated areas in general tend to show lower propensity to vote for populist parties as compared to intermediate areas, peri-urban and peri-rural areas. When it comes to the demographic factors, we see a strong negative association between population over 60 and the propensity to vote for populist parties, and the opposite holds true for the male to female ratio. So the more male-dominated demography a specific municipality has, the higher the probability this municipality will cast high proportion of votes to populist parties. Also, the tertiary education, the university degree information is extremely strong predictor, which is strongly associated with, negatively associated with the propensity to vote for populist parties, and the opposite holds true for unemployment rate. The higher the unemployment rate, the higher the share of votes going to populist parties. And finally, when it comes to household finances, we see that it's the evolution of household income that is generally more important than income levels in the different areas. So taking all those pieces of evidence into account, what would be our summary of the patterns that we have observed with this or through these models? First of all, we conclude that there is a substantial degree of heterogeneity across countries at the Nordic level. So, for example, looking at the baseline percentage of vote going to populist parties. As Camila's map showed before, there is a very extreme wide difference between Denmark and the remaining countries. So Denmark being lower percentage of vote going to populist parties in the last election, and also taking into account how this classification is done by populist compared to the remaining countries. We also see that the green transitions matter, even if this interpretation is not so straightforward. We will try to come up with a hypothesis on these patterns in a while. But other factors are also very important. We see that the degree of urbanization, demographic makeup, educational attainment levels, and unemployment are very strong predictors for this populist vote, and probably also for public discontent. Also, we see with this modeling framework that most of our models show good fit to the data, but potential underspecification due to potential lack or omitted variables. So many of these models struggle to account for the variance on the data to a level that we would consider acceptable in an econometric framework. And with all these considerations into account, we essentially come up with two learnings. First, and probably based more directly on this evidence, is that our models probably lack one perspective, which is these cultural aspects that were discussed before by my colleague Myriam. So we are mostly focusing on economic, on social divides and narratives, but we are not covering properly with this modeling framework the cultural aspects that are extremely important, also the recognitional narratives as well. And also when it comes to specifically the green transition factors, our hypothesis explaining why this association between the location or the closeness of these meeting facilities and the strong association with this lower propensity to vote for populist parties in those municipalities, our hypothesis is that these large meeting facilities that are generally large industrial players might be contributing to these communities on different levels. First of all, they would be providing good working conditions for the people directly employed, but also they have important multiplying effects that ripple out in the local economies and create good conditions for the economies, for the local economies to flourish, and for other people in those areas to actually find good jobs in the ancillary activities, but also because these players, these large industrial players, make a big contribution in terms of taxes to the local administrations that could also improve the accessibility or the availability of local services. So with all these considerations, we think that there is a combination of things in place that contribute to explain this relationship, this association between the presence of these facilities and populist vote. And this is all for the modeling.
Very good. Thank you very much, Carlos. And actually stay here for a little while because we don't have many questions to go into right now. We got some very interesting comments in the chat and we will bring those up in the panel because I think they will be relevant for that discussion. But you already highlighted that it is very complex and there are different factors at play. And I've launched another poll because I want to see, again from the audience, how do you see these factors and drivers? What do you see as the most relevant? We will continue this discussion with our panelists in just a few moments, but it's very interesting to see that we've looked a lot at the economic factors, unemployment, income gaps and such, and that is also coming at the top of the list from the audience responses. The clear number one, with 72% of the voters picking that as a relevant driver so far. There is also about a half of the vote of those who participated in the poll that say that spatial inequalities, urban and rural disparities are also very relevant. And there's been some very interesting discussion about urban, rural, what is in between, different types of typologies and ways to categorize areas going on in the chat. Have a look at the chat if you haven't yet. And as you've seen from the typology that we've used, we also classify areas into different types of regions. And this we will also continue to discuss. Place matters, but what kind of places and in what sense. Sociocultural shifts also getting a lot of votes in the poll. Migration, changing values and such. 42% at the moment have indicated that as relevant. And then about a fourth of respondents, 23%, say that large-scale transition, such as the green transition, is also playing into it. There the link is also perhaps a bit more indirect, and we will go into it in the panel as well. But so far, I would say that it's very well aligned with what we have seen so far and what the literature and research has shown. And there's also been a lot of links and additional resources shared in the chat, so very well aligned. How do you feel about discussing this further? Is there something that you want to dive into with the panel next?
Well, I think that the most important aspect is how we combine all these pieces of information in a sensitive way, so that how we make sense of all of this complicated combination of factors that stretch from very material issues on economy level, living conditions, to very perception-related aspects, more related to how you feel invested in the social, economic, cultural order, and how that then reflects or is reflected on the voting level. So it's about building the puzzle with all these small pieces that we should really focus on.
All right, we've got quite a few of those puzzle pieces on the table. Let's see if some have already fallen on the floor, and let's pick them back up. Stay here with me. I will also invite another researcher from Nordregio, Nora Sánchez Gassen, to join us here. And then we will bring in some reinforcement, because as you said, it's a complicated topic, and we want to make sure that we've covered our bases. So we want to bring in some additional views in the form of a panel discussion. So for the next part, as I said, we've divided this webinar into two parts. Now you've heard a little bit about our research. The rest is reserved for a discussion. So we will go into a panel discussion with Susanne, Wallman, Lundåsen, who is a senior associate professor from Linköping University. We've got Tomas Hanell, who is a senior research fellow from the Migration Institute in Finland. And we've got Merethe Dotterud Leiren, who is the research director of CICERO, the Center for International Climate Research. So we've got experience and insights on political discontent, voting, coming from Susanne. We've got research that Tomas has done on satisfaction with life, quality of life, inequalities at the Nordic level. And we've got Merethe, who's looked into the green transition. And let's see if we can connect these dots and go into what we can make of the Nordic discontent and where are we going. So talking about public discontent, we saw in the polls, we've seen in the research that there is the sense of discontent emerging, but are we really seeing that? What kind of expressions of discontent are there? Susanne, maybe we start with you. What have you seen in your research? Similarities with what we've brought up, or perhaps some additional perspectives? How can we grasp such an abstract topic that is difficult to measure and to quantify?
Yes, thank you for the invitation to participate today in this really exciting seminar. Yes, we have found similarities with your studies. I've been part of a research project on social polarization, mainly focusing on Sweden and center-periphery divides within Sweden. And we worked with survey data, and theoretically we've tried to divide the types of discontent that you can find. There is a symbolic discontent, where you feel looked down upon by others, that your way of life is looked down upon by others. And there is material discontent, where you perceive that your society, your local community, is not receiving its fair share of resources. And there's also political discontent, where residents perceive that other areas or other communities are being favored, that politicians and the local public administration somehow are biased in favor of other locations. And we see these divides also within at a very small scale within municipalities. And we can hypothesize that people use their local community as a sort of heuristic, both to try to understand whether decision makers care about people like me, and whether they care about places like the place where I live, and also whether society is moving in the right or wrong direction. And we take cues from what we experience in our daily life. Also, whether my local community is doing okay compared to other local communities in my country or in the rest of the world. And also whether you perceive that society is moving as a whole in the right or wrong direction based on the cues that you receive from what you experience in your daily life. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is very interesting. And you said that you've looked at survey data, we've looked at voting data. Is there something else, something that would be useful to factor in, something that we might have overlooked? We also did some interviews, but it turns out that this is even a difficult topic to discuss at times. So what other tools or approaches can we use to approach the topic?
I think that perhaps not tools, but often this discussion about discontent ends up being urban-rural divide in how we talk about it. But we actually found that there is discontent also within very urban areas. But the form, the political expression that this type of discontent takes is different than the rural discontent. But people who perceive to be marginalized in urban communities also feel sort of a place-based discontent, that they are being disadvantaged compared to richer local communities within their municipality. So it's not only, I would say, an urban-rural divide, but also sort of a center-periphery divide that can be a peripheralization, that is a perception of being neglected, even if you live in the capital, but in a marginalized community within the capital.
Yeah, so starting from your own surroundings and trying to keep up with the changing pace of the world, and then you either perceive to have or not to have possibilities to get involved. We have also touched upon inclusiveness and involvement and engagement and the sense of being left behind in our research. Is there maybe something to add from our side, Nora?
Yeah, we can come to it later, but I mean, we see this here in our project now. We see it also in other projects that it keeps coming back as a central factor, right? That nowadays, maybe in the past, policy making was perhaps a bit more top down, but we see that more and more people are really want to be engaged. At least specific groups of people, they really want to be engaged and want to have a say, and also want to feel that their input makes a difference. So citizen participation, citizen engagement becomes more and more important. And then, of course, we can talk about also how that is done and when that is done, and how you work with the input you get from citizens. All of this matters, but we see that this becomes more and more important, and perhaps especially at local level, where opportunities for this, of course, are you're closer to the citizens.
I just want to add a small thing connected to that we can see in our Swedish data, a divide between those who are involved in their local community, in civil society, and and those who are discontent but not involved. Those are distinct groups, where those who are discontent but involved in civil society tend to be more focused on decision makers when they are discontent, whereas those who are discontent and also disconnected from civil society tend to have a very dark or more dark outlook on society as a whole, as they tend to distrust others and also their political leaders. So the discontent, those who are discontent are not all similar.
Yeah, that is definitely an interesting point. And it's good that you mentioned the Swedish data, because I think as we've seen, there are some, let's say, maybe Nordic emerging trends or perhaps a bit varied, but we definitely see big differences between countries and also within countries. Going a bit more into that, I want to turn to Tomas a little bit and see what we could maybe take away from Finland, and in terms of inequalities and quality of life. How closely or broadly do we have to look at the topic? Are we really that unequal, or where is this? What might be fueling the sense of discontent? Where is it coming from?
Thank you for the invitation. Maybe a word about inequality first. If you take this economic approach and study economic inequality, and base this study on income, I think that one misses a lot of the real inequality, economic inequality. Take, for instance, Sweden. It's more equal in income than the EU average. But then when you look at wealth inequality, Sweden is not only topping the Europe in wealth inequality, but also more unequal in wealth than the United States or India or Mexico. So that is an issue also that, and I know, of course, that we don't have this data at the local level, but we can't. But then coming to more quality of life related issues, maybe a first topic is the fact that in all 5 Nordic countries, the attachment to place is very much connected to the size of your area of residence. So in big cities, people are not attached to the place, and in the countryside and small cities, people are more attached to the place. So this is particularly in Finland, but also Iceland and Norway have this pattern very clearly. And this means that if you care about the place you live, you are also much more sensitive how it's being treated, not only in the discourse, but also as a kind of a factual state. And it's very it's controversial that when you ask Nordic citizens living in different places, for instance, how satisfied are you with your life? How satisfied are you with the present state of economy or the state of education or your health services? There are no urban-rural differences, apart from life satisfaction, where rural residents are happier. So on nearly all standard measurements, you cannot kind of get a grip on this discontent. But then, when you start asking about political participation, how much influence do you have on a political decision, or what is your own ability to participate in politics, and also kind of the trust in the country's institutions, in the parliament, legal system, politicians, political parties, even scientists. There you have a clear rural-urban divide, where rural residents feel that they don't have the capacity to partake in political decision making. And I think this, I mean, it's been already said here today, but it comes out very, very clearly from the data. So I think that is one of the issues that we need to focus more on in the future. So not only trying to explain this with economic and variables, but also with these participatory variables.
Yeah, definitely. And since you mentioned inequalities and also the accumulation of wealth and the growing disparities in that regard, I want to pick up one aspect from the chat. Atle mentioned that he's missing one dimension in this discussion, the question of class. We have this idea of Nordics as very egalitarian and equal and fair. Do you maybe have thoughts on that? Should we think more about these broader trends perhaps over time?
Well, the issue of class is kind of difficult today. It was much easier in the 70s. But what is a class? And I would say that due to the fact that you have kind of intersectionality between different class factors, that it's difficult to define a single individual into one particular box, because you would be in many boxes at the same time. And therefore, I mean, I understand the point for that, but it would be technically very challenging to do such an analysis. And of course, when you look at education, or you look at incomes and stuff like that, there is a small portion of this class aspect also included in those. But then there are many. I mean, one would have to look also at if you have. I would assume there is a difference if you are the first generation in your family to kind of go one notch higher in the class hierarchy than that you have been there already for 7 generations. So there are many issues here which at least I see as quite challenging to include in such an analysis. But I'm pretty sure, yes, some sort of class plays a role here.
Yeah, that is an interesting dimension, and there doesn't seem to be a very easy or clear-cut way to go about it. I will come back to you as well, but since we saw that also these big transformations do play a role, and we have a green transition happening and changing regions, municipalities, cities, labor market, economies. I just want to turn to that direction for a little moment. We also have some interesting discussions in the chat, and I want to bring those in. But more importantly, I also want to bring Merethe into the discussion. In terms of green transition and the link between political attitudes, how do you see it based on the work that you've done?
Yeah, so my colleagues who study political attitudes and populism, they find that there is a relationship between attitudes to climate change and voting for populist parties. But this relationship is much weaker than the relationship between attitudes to immigration and voting for populist parties. So attitudes towards immigration play a much larger role than attitudes to climate change for populist voting. Another issue is that the direction of the relationship between attitudes to climate change and voting for populist parties is not clear. We don't know whether people who tend to be against climate policies vote for populist parties, or whether those who vote for populist parties tend to adopt the climate skepticism from the parties they vote for, so that their climate change opinions are being influenced by the party. Because we do see that populist parties use climate strategically as an issue to attract voters.
Yeah, there is this sort of, well, which way does the circle go, for sure. But there seems to be a link clearly, one way or another. And how do you see it going forward in terms of green jobs and the continuing change? Are the green jobs and these further changes that are coming, are they more of an opportunity or a threat? Is it something that is going to add to these divisions, or are there maybe some ways to bridge some of these gaps?
Yeah, so looking at your findings, I think are very interesting, because you find that there's a higher share of people who vote for populist parties in municipalities that have a large share of green jobs, and that the opposite is true in municipalities where old industries or carbon emitting facilities are located. So there is some resemblance to what we find when we look at people's opinions on wind power. So at CICERO, we have a yearly climate survey where we ask people about their opinions on different climate measures. And we find that the population in areas with a lot of wind power, they express more negative attitudes to wind power than other respondents. And those that express these negative attitudes to wind power, they also vote for populist parties to a larger extent. But there's perhaps also an issue with the analysis because you have included all the populist parties in your analysis, including also the Red Party in Norway. This is a socialist party which is not systematically against climate policies. So perhaps the relationship that you find would be somewhat weaker if you included only the populist parties that have a clear stance against climate policy. And then, because of everything that's happening in the world right now, with Trump and the US on the agenda everywhere, I just thought I'd bring in some findings from the US, because there's this famous book by Ali Russell Hochschild called Strangers in Their Own Land, where Hochschild explores why there's so little support for environmental regulation among residents in areas with high concentration of petrochemical plants and a high level of pollution. You would think that residents living in an area with high pollution would be in favor of environmental regulation. Instead, people living in areas with a lot of polluting jobs tend to vote for populist parties. So that's a different finding than what you find. And Hochschild, she finds that there's a sense of injustice fueling this. Rural Americans see government and politics as corrupt. They share a sense that the economic future is bleak. They don't believe government policies will help. They believe that redistributive policies are unfair to rural communities. Whether this is true or not, the perception remains that government policies favor cities over the countryside. So she finds that the rural Americans tend to identify more with their place and also let cultural values lead the way in what they're voting for. And this reminds me a bit of also Susanne's work, where she also shows that people in rural areas in the Nordic countries also identify more with their place. And also when Tomas suggests that people in rural areas, also in the Nordic countries, trust the political and legal system less than in urban areas, I think this is something we really need to take seriously. But coming back to whether green jobs are seen as an opportunity or a threat, I think the answer is both. It's not the green jobs in themselves that's a threat. It's rather the characteristics of the green projects that's a threat. And that's in particular because they pose a threat to the existing culture and identity. There's one concept that hasn't been mentioned so far, and that's the battle for land. Because a lot of the climate industries or the climate projects, it requires a lot of land. And if you look at wind power, which is one of the sectors that I'm looking at, you see that wind power projects are built in wild nature, untouched nature, on top of a mountain where the wind resources are, or there's a lot of wind. And you're also touching into the areas of the Sami people and reindeer herding. And it's often in the rural areas where you change the landscape, and perhaps it threatens the place identity somewhat. But it does, yeah. So we see that the largest drivers for wind power projects, that's the economic benefits, the income, but the largest counterforce is rather cultural values.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And we also have a lot of research at Nordregio on regional development issues and land use considerations and such. And this is definitely an issue that keeps coming back not only in green energy projects, but also in a lot of development and future-oriented activities. There's a very nice question in the chat, and I want to raise it to all of our panelists, including my colleagues here in the studio, because it kind of connects with what we've been discussing. And I also wanted to get some of your insights on where should we go from here? What should we emphasize going forward? So Daniela is asking whether green transition is more of a semantic attempt to describe just another way of exploiting the sparsely populated areas. And she would like to know if there are some ways, or how can we create a transition that is more socially just and ecocentric. So we see that these dimensions play into it, but what should we do? Where should we go from here? Carlos, maybe we take a quick comment from you, either something that we need more research on or something to keep in mind at the policy level.
Yes, well, maybe I would say something about the discussion that was like sort of started before, in particular focusing on this urban-rural divide and what we see in our model. So we, in relation to previous research, we have added a lot of nuance to this urban-rural divide. We are not only considering 3 classes, urban, rural, intermediate, but 6. So we don't only look at rural areas as a single class, but rather as a continuum of different types of degree of urbanization areas. But when we do that, we see that there is an interesting pattern emerging, which is that it's not the most remote, sparsely populated areas, those that are actually showing greater propensity to vote for populist parties. On the contrary, they even show lower propensity than those living in cities, which makes us think that this cultural aspect about more traditional views of even the political system are at play here as well. So those who live in those areas probably have more traditional relationship with the political system, and then also probably have less incentive to sort of try to find new solutions. And this connects again with this location of immediate facilities, in the sense that also there people are probably are more invested in the current socioeconomic order. They have probably less need to find alternative solutions. So connecting these two things, I think, is important because it drives us away from these more economic aspects, and this gives us more like a broader picture on the cultural views of different social groups. And also important to see rural areas as not a single monosonic group of municipalities, but rather as a very diverse also continuum of areas. And when it comes to the things that might require further research, probably this is one of those also, like trying to understand how these cultural aspects play out in different places, because they don't work exactly in the same way. So for one reason or another, discontent is expressed differently in different areas, and also the motivations for that discontent may vary between areas. And we know relatively little about that. As Susanne was saying before, there is a lot of inner peripheries as well within urban areas, even within rural areas. We are not considering so far. That can make a difference. So that would be my take on.
Yes. So not trying to oversimplify, but to really look at the different nuances and try to appreciate the local realities. Tomas, let's go over to you. How do you see the way forward? What should we do, and can we make the future fairer and more just?
I mean, I'm now talking up from the
Finnish perspective, because let's say wind power is the mechanisms differ so much across the countries. But in a Finnish context, for instance, wind power or mining or whatever, which is not green transition, there is a large section of spatial injustice, because usually wind power projects are initiated and directed from either investment companies or otherwise large players that are not usually local. And this, of course, causes much resent among the local citizens, because they don't get basically anything out of it except property tax, usually, which is also then declining over the years. And so I think this when it comes to these green investments, the notion of it, even if it's not true, but it's in this fact, I would argue it's true in Finland, that there is a large proportion of spatial injustice. Then you can add to that, from the other point of view, Eastern Finland, where it's kind of practically forbidden to create wind power parks, because the defense forces, their radars prohibit that. And that also means that local companies in Eastern Finland, where there would be very much good possibilities for local wind power, are their hands are tied. So there is also this opposite spatial injustice aspect. So I think this is a crucial issue when it comes to making a green transition in energy production, for instance, in rural areas. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. Susanne, coming back to you, is there something we can do to engage people, give them a chance to have an impact on their local decision-making or processes?
Yes, I think many municipalities attempt to engage citizens in decision-making processes and having citizen dialogues and so on and so forth. But I think it's also important to remember that many local communities have historical legacies that may go way back. The stories of having been unfairly treated by either the central state, or we have had reforms in Sweden and in the other Nordic countries where municipalities have become merged. And so those who previously were in the center of a municipality nowadays find themselves in the periphery. And in some communities, perhaps not so much in the most urban areas, but in the more sparsely populated areas where the distances between communities can be big within municipalities, these conflicts can be maintained over time. And if you repeat the story among citizens, among residents, that we are the cards, the game is perpetually stacked against our community, you tend to perpetuate that story. But yeah, so to be place sensitive in local politics, I think it's important. But I would also like to stress that it's not an easy equation for local politicians to address. Many communities have a declining population. So the economic equation that they face in what services to offer where, it's a complex issue, and it's often ridden with conflict. If you close facilities in one location and keep them in other locations, this tends to fuel discontent within local communities. Yeah.
Yes, so taking that local history and also making it work in place. Merethe, I'll give the final word in the panel to you, because we also have some recommendations based on our research to share to wrap up with. But keeping with the green transition logic, you've looked at big projects, you highlighted some of the challenges, but do you see do you have some tips on how to make them more inclusive in the future?
Yeah, well, I think justice has been mentioned here, and that's a key word. And we need to look at the whole policy process, because people are concerned with processes being fair. Are people well informed, included, and does it actually matter what they say? Information and dialogue without real influence, or the perception that it actually matters what people are saying, can create resistance rather than support. That's a key finding in the literature. We also see that people are very concerned with whether the consequences of these new climate projects are fairly distributed. So who gains and who loses, especially the balance between what the investors get and what the local community gains. So you have this focus on economic ripple effects in terms of value creation, number of jobs. And we see that municipalities, which already have companies that are competitive and able to win contracts, they benefit a lot. And then it's also to communicate very, very clearly the purpose of, for example, energy projects. We see that wind power, for example, is supported to a much larger extent where it's developed to be used domestically, preferably locally, and meant to serve their own industry rather than, for example, for export. And then you have this distinction between people who care more about nature conservation and those who are more concerned with wind energy as a climate measure. And in the Norwegian debate, you see nature and climate kind of being presented as opposites. And sometimes I think we forget what climate policy is all about. It is really about saving nature. So we really need to find a balance and be very careful about what we use our land for. But you're talking about solutions. There are a lot of experimenting with citizen assemblies, like Susanne also mentioned, at different levels, at municipal, national, and even EU level with the climate pacts. So, but this is still a bit of a trial and error. We see that the literature on deliberative democracy recommends creating groups that are small enough to be genuinely deliberative and at the same time representative enough to be democratic. So to be deliberative, it means that the participants receive relevant information and engage in an open discussion. And to be representative, the participants need to be selected to represent the wider population. And then there's also another solution where you're looking at the ownership side of projects, like encouraging or facilitating for including citizens as owner of, for example, renewable energy projects, like local ownership, community energy. It tends to make people more positively inclined towards climate projects. But I think in general, the clue is to find some solution, some processes where people are actually seen and understood as experts on their own lives, but at the same time being conscious and aware about the fact that people don't fully grasp perhaps what at least the climate transition is all about. That there is a need for changing habits and in addition to technological substitutes.
Yes, thank you, Merethe, thank you, Susanne, thank you, Tomas, thank you, Nora, thank you, Carlos. I think this is enough, and that's a very good note to end the panel on. We really need to keep testing new solutions and building on successful examples. Talking about those, we have an example of how to build renewable energy projects that are inclusive. In the chat, have a look at it and share your own if you have more. I think it would be very interesting to hear more about these concrete examples. But as time is running and as we're getting close to the end of the webinar, we have one final segment for you, and we want to highlight, as said, some of the policy recommendations and tips from our side based on our research. So I will leave the floor to Nora for some final statements on what the policy implications of all this are.
Yes, thank you, Miia, and thank you to Carlos and the other colleagues and also our panelists for a very engaged discussion. And I think one thing we can all take away from this is how complex it really is to discuss discontent in the context of the green transition, in the context of changing voting patterns. It's very complex to understand, to analyze this phenomenon. We've talked about all the different factors that can influence discontent. We've talked about that there's spatial differences between rural areas, urban areas, but even within municipalities. And we know that discontent can be expressed in different ways, that we have to maybe use different tools to really understand it and also understand what it is directed towards. Miia announced that we have some policy recommendations. Maybe I would not go so far as to call it that. We know, of course, that there is no simple solutions to such a complex topic, but at least we wanted to share some reflections. What are some of the things perhaps we can take with us here in the Nordic context going forward as we plan the green transition and as we try to address discontent? What is some of the reflections perhaps to take away? At least that's some of the messages that we see emerging from our research. We talked a lot in this panel or in this discussion today about spatial disparities, about the context in which people live, and my colleague Carlos presented some results there. And we see that there are spatial disparities when it comes to demographic, social, economic conditions, and we see that at least some of them, they matter for discontent. They are associated with discontent at local level. This, I think, again, just underscores the importance of some of the regional development policies that we are doing. Of course, we have a long tradition with regional development policies here in the Nordic region, trying to improve economic development across our countries, trying to create good living conditions across our countries. And I think the result that we have, and perhaps also part of the discussion, underscores that this remains important, that we try to address spatial but also social inequalities, that this matters for discontent, where you live and how you perceive your situation compared to others. So a continued focus on this, trying to have place-based development, looking at what are the strengths and weaknesses of different areas and how can we accommodate them. This remains a very important focus going forward, not just for overall economic development, but also here with a link to discontent. We have talked also quite a bit about the green transition. We see that there's a lot of opportunities with the green transition. Jobs may be created, there's going to be green investments, but we've also heard that the green transition in itself, green investments in themselves, can create discontent depending on how they are done. Another aspect that we could add here is, or one thing we want to highlight, is that perhaps we have to think more strongly about what kind of jobs emerge actually from the green transition. There's quite a few discussions when you talk about the green transition on how many jobs might be created, where jobs might be lost, what kind of changes are happening in our labor market. But maybe rather than just focusing on the number of jobs and where jobs are being created, we have to think about what kind of jobs are being created, what are the conditions, and how do local communities really benefit from this. And I think here we can link this to the rather interesting finding I think that we had, that discontent seems to be lower in municipalities that host these polluting facilities. Think about oil, think about the petrochemical industry, think about steel production, cement production, and all that. We know that in some of the communities which have these facilities, these are rather important local employers. And historically, they've offered rather good jobs as well to the people who live in those areas. Stable jobs with opportunities for career development, strong representation of the unions and so forth. So maybe we have to think in the green transition, not just what kind of jobs we offer, but also the quality and what they mean for local municipalities, if they also create perhaps a sense of identity, because we see, at least from the past, this seems to matter. So maybe an important aspect to add to all of these discussions. We also see in our results that demography matters, people matter. We see that discontent tends to be higher in municipalities with an overrepresentation of men. And I'm sure you all know, if we talk about municipalities with an overrepresentation of men, that tends to be rural areas, more peripheral areas, which experience outmigration to urban areas. And a lot of young people leave, a lot of women leave, and that leaves us with these demographic components. All of this, again, of course, then also ties again to this larger discussion that we're having in the Nordic cooperation, how we can create attractive municipalities, how we can maintain attractive municipalities throughout our countries. And I think this really plays a role here as well. How can we make it possible or easier for people to actually stay in the areas where they were born and raised? How can we perhaps attract newcomers, but also how can we can we create attractive communities for the people who remain there? What can be done there? And there's quite a lot of information, quite a lot of work going on there. I can just mention one project we had recently at Nordregio, I think 1 or 2 years ago, we talked to a youth panel, youth from rural areas, and asked them, what do you need to stay in rural areas? What do you need to stay where you were raised? What would you like to see? What is important to you? And these youth gave quite clear recommendations on what they would like to see and where they see that priorities lie. Some of the usual suspects, access to education, economic opportunities, etc., but also things related to social community. We can mention the time is running out. I'm just briefly mentioning again the role of public service provision. We have heard here in the panel that it's important when public services close down. It really matters for attractiveness, it matters for discontent, it matters for the jobs. So also here again, when we plan public service provision and whether to close or to uphold different services, it's not just the finances that matter. We need to look at these ripple effects on discontent, even though that might be more difficult to measure. It's very important. We've also been we kept coming back to citizenship participation in policymaking at different levels. So again, also just to emphasize this, it may be not a complete solution to discontent, but one step to make people more involved and invested in their communities if they can have a say, and if it's not just one-off, but if there's really an ongoing dialogue and they feel that they are being heard and their input is respected. And finally, we want to also mention again, electoral participation. This is maybe not a recipe for solving discontent, but in our democracies, electoral participation turnout is important. That's what our democracies are based on. And also there we see rural-urban differences. So also here, I think going forward, we have to keep an eye on that. Is there something we can do to perhaps remove barriers to voting, to encourage people to vote, to make sure that our election and the results are really representative and represent really the whole spectrum of political priorities in the Nordic countries? That's also important for the future of our democracies. And with that, I end here. Miia, you come back to me.
I will come back. Thank you, Nora, for summarizing the discussion and sharing some of our thoughts going forward from here. As we've said, we have all this material available online. You have the links in the chat. You can download the reports. You can go more into depth and have a look at our analysis and maps and see what else you might take out from those. In addition to the policy brief and the notes that Nora just shared, we have discussion papers looking at Nordic geographies of discontent. We have looked at income inequalities and disparities across the Nordics. And we've also put all of these different factors that play into the bigger picture on a map so you can scan through and get a visual overview of how it works. At this point, there's not much more for me to say than to thank you very much for joining and for being very active throughout the discussion. The chat was wonderfully active. We will collect all these inputs and share some of the highlights in the webinar follow-up, which is coming soon. You will get the recording, you will get links to all the material, as well as some additional resources. So stay tuned. We hope to see you in our next webinars, some of them addressing these very same and similar topics. So have a look at our news, subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't yet, and have a very nice rest of the day. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.